All right, let's just dive right into this explainer. Today, we're looking at the true story of the 1990s Seattle grunge scene, peeling back that glossy MTV-era mythology to uncover how a rainy, isolated logging city accidentally took over the entire music world. Welcome to the explainer. So, what if the 90s grunge scene you remember was actually, well, a carefully packaged myth? Today we're asking a really fascinating question. Was the flannel-clad mainstream explosion of the Seattle sound an authentic accident, or was it something deliberately manufactured by clever marketers? As we dig into the source material today, you'll see it's actually a pretty wild mix of both.
Look at the 1980s mainstream rock scene. It was completely obsessed with slick excess, right? Spandex, hairspray, flashy solos, endless partying. But tucked away in the Pacific Northwest, the Seattle underground was building something completely different. It was this isolated ecosystem built on actual poverty, thrift store workwear, and this gritty, unflinching honesty. They absolutely weren't trying to be rock stars. They were actively reacting against them.
Here's the roadmap for today. 1. Roots of the Seattle sound. 2. Manufacturing the grunge myth. 3. Tragedy at the ground level. 4. Mainstream explosion and commodification. And 5. Burnout, loss, and legacy. All right, Section 1, Roots of the Seattle Sound. Let's start at the very beginning with the raw ingredients that forged this massive sonic revolution long before the rest of the world was paying attention.
Grunge wasn't just random noise. It was a highly deliberate sonic choice. If you look at the musical DNA, it's pretty specific. They essentially took the speed and DIY defiance of punk rock and literally slowed it down to a sludgy, mid-tempo crawl. They tuned their guitars way down, usually to drop D, and then just drowned everything in heavy Black Sabbath-style fuzz, using Proco Rat and Big Muff pedals. Add in that distorted feedback style pioneered by Neil Young, and boom, you've got the unmistakable DNA of the Seattle sound.
But here's a crazy detail. The term grunge was never even meant to be a serious genre label. Back in 1981, Seattle musician Mark Arm actually used the word as a joke in a fanzine letter just to describe his own band's awful noise, referencing literal dirt or grime. It was purely self-mockery. But, eventually record labels caught on and literally stamped it on their catalogs as a badge of honor.
Now, you really can't grasp this whole movement without acknowledging the foundational bands that built the ecosystem. You had the U-Men pioneering this heavy art punk noise in the early 80s. Then the Melvins come along and deliberately slow punk down to an absolute crawl, which deeply inspired young kids in Aberdeen, including Kurt Cobain. And of course Green River, who released a 1987 EP famously marketed in a catalog as Ultra Loose Grunge. Together they built a real community out of geographic isolation and a total lack of expensive recording studios.
Moving on to Section 2, Manufacturing the grunge myth. Let's look at how this evolved from a highly guarded local secret into a very deliberate global marketing strategy.
The infrastructure actually moved surprisingly fast. In 1986, CZ Records dropped the Deep Six compilation, planting the earliest flag for the scene. Fast forward to 1988, Sub Pop Records officially launches, introducing their absolute genius of a subscription service, the Singles Club. And then by 1989, the scene goes international. A British journalist from Melody Maker flies to Seattle, completely ready to hype the city up. So the local scene was formalizing rapidly.
But we have to recognize that it wasn't purely organic. Promoters, alongside local journalists at the influential publication The Rocket, essentially engineered a mythos for the scene. They leveraged that British press to hype these bands as these mysterious icons of the Pacific Northwest. They literally took the reality of rainy poverty and cheap flannel and deliberately marketed it into a global brand of authentic working-class heroes. And their ultimate calling card? Total self-deprecating irony. Sub Pop literally printed the motto, "Going out of business since 1988" on their promotional material, right alongside those famously iconic loser t-shirts. It was their way of proving they didn't care at all about traditional success, even as they were actively masterminding a massive cultural takeover.
Section 3. Tragedy at the ground level. Because beneath all that marketing hype and those glossy MTV montages, there was a much darker, ground-level reality that the mainstream narrative almost always glosses over.
This music wasn't just some vague teen angst, you guys. It was a fiercely tight-knit community processing real, visceral trauma together. When Mother Love Bone's singer Andrew Wood tragically passed away in 1990, his roommate Chris Cornell was absolutely devastated.
Out of that profound grief sprang Temple of the Dog, uniting members of Soundgarden and the guys who would soon become Pearl Jam, including a very young Eddie Vedder. They essentially turned their deep community loss into this remarkably beautiful collaborative tribute album.
And that shared trauma extended very heavily to the women in the scene too. The entire community was completely shaken by the horrific 1993 unsolved murder of Mia Zapata, the beloved singer of the band The Gits. Valerie Agnew, from the blistering punk band 7 Year Bitch, summed it up perfectly. She didn't just want to mourn. She wanted to change the equation. They absolutely refused to just be victims.
So the scene fought back. They pivoted from mourning a tragic loss to creating Home Alive, an organization that actually offered practical, sliding-scale self-defense classes. They were actively teaching women how to fight back and break holds, proving that this community was ultimately about fiercely protecting each other, not just getting up on stage and playing music.
Section 4. Mainstream explosion and commodification. This is where the secret completely gets out, and we enter the era where the underground violently collides with global commercialism.
As these bands exploded into the mainstream, the live scene was just chaotic, sweaty, and honestly, pretty dangerous. You can see this feeling beautifully immortalized by photographer Charles Peterson. Notice how his immersive, high-contrast, blurred photography just perfectly captures the sheer destructive energy of being thrown around in a packed, sweaty club.
But with that raw energy came the absolute absurdity of mainstream success. I mean, think about it. Nirvana's Nevermind literally dethrones Michael Jackson on the charts. Hollywood cashes in on the aesthetic with the 1992 movie Singles. High-fashion designer Marc Jacobs creates a literal silk grunge runway collection. It all reached peak comedy when a former Sub Pop employee actually tricked the New York Times into publishing a fake lexicon of grunge, feeding them entirely made-up slang like lamestain. It just proved exactly how little the mainstream actually understood the culture they were so desperately consuming.
13 million. Just let that number sink in for a second. 13 million is the staggering number of copies Pearl Jam's debut album 10 eventually sold, reaching 13 times platinum. The financial stakes of alternative rock were changed forever. I mean, these were guys playing dingy dive bars just a few years earlier, and suddenly they're caught right in the middle of a multi-million-dollar industrial machine.
Section 5. Burnout, Loss, and Legacy. Because a rocket this heavy, carrying that much pressure, simply couldn't stay in orbit forever. This brings us to the devastating fall and the aftermath that followed. The most crucial takeaway here is that the scene eventually buckled under the exact same pressures it originally set out to rebel against. The sheer, crushing weight of sudden global fame, combined with the devastating grip of heroin addiction, led to the profound and tragic loss of generational icons like Kurt Cobain and Layne Staley. Ultimately, the underground just couldn't survive the mainstream intact.
Yet, despite all of those unimaginable tragedies, the imprint this scene left is massive. The core ethos of prioritizing gritty honesty over slick spectacle actually survived. It influenced Gen X's total rejection of musical slickness, it cemented Doc Martens and thrifted flannels as enduring high fashion, and it's continually cycling back into youth culture. Even today, you see Gen Z driving a massive grunge gaze revival on TikTok.
So I'll leave you with a final thought today. The next time you put on a 90s playlist, take a second to think about the real human elements behind those distorted guitars. Was the tragic cost of global fame inevitable for these bands? Or is the true, lasting legacy of grunge found in that resilient community, the one that formed things like Home Alive to desperately try and survive it all? Thanks so much for exploring this incredible story with me in today's Explainer.